everybody, and welcome back to Principles of Game Design. This video is going to be all about setting up our scene for rendering and getting some nice pretty pictures out of our models. So to start with, if you have your bounding box and your reference images visible, we're going to want to go ahead and hide those. And the way we're going to do that is by coming down to our layers panel and hitting these pretty little V's that stand for visibility and turn them off. Once we've done that, we want to create a floor and a couple of walls. So we're going to click Disk up here in our poly modeling shelf and hit the F key to go ahead and zoom in on it. Now by default, the disk plane has a bunch of crisscrossing edges. We're going to fix that by popping open our channel box, going to the poly disk inputs, and changing our subdivision mode to caps. And that'll give us some rings. Let's make this a circle again, crank up our sides, let's go to 10, and add in a couple of extra subdivisions. Then we're going to zoom back out, go to our scale tool, and we're going to make this nice and big. I'm going to go ahead and hide my grid, and now we're going to go ahead and move our edges. So I'm going to double click the exterior edge, and I'm going to go ahead and hold shift and extrude them up. And that's going to give me some nice walls. Go to face, and then we're going to delete a couple of these so that we can see what's happening inside. Now that we've done that, I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to hit 3 for smooth preview, and I'm going to control and deselect my walls so that I can get an idea of what our scene looks like. And you'll notice that our disk is giving us this really hard edge. I'm not a huge fan of that, so I'm going to go back to my one view, and I'm going to select, double click some of these edge loops, and I'm just going to move them up to create something that feels like a nice smooth incline. But I don't want to edit the edges underneath the chair because I want to keep the ground nice and flat. Then I'm going to go back to object mode, smooth preview, deselect it, and that harsh ring is gone. I'm going to zoom out a bit, and this is going to be where I render my chair from now on. So I'm going to go ahead and file, save scene as, and I'm going to go ahead and name this chair underscore renders. Let's zoom back in, and now let's start thinking about lighting. So up here in the top right, I'm going to go to my Arnold menu. I'm going to pop this open, and I'm going to click this render button. And what that's going to do is it's going to open up the Arnold render view here in a bit. Hopefully, oh, there it is. Sorry, wrong window. And we're going to get this little black square, and as I rotate my camera, we'll see this progress bar saying that it's attempting to update the render, but there are no lights in the scene, so we won't be able to see anything. Let's hit this red square to stop the video renders, go back up to Arnold, go down to the lights menu, and I'm going to start by adding in a skydome light. We're going to zoom out and see that the skydome light is all around our scene, zoom back in, hit play, and now we can start rendering out that chair against our background. And it'll update the render as we move the camera. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and hit that red stop button again. And now let's go ahead and make this a little bit prettier. Currently, the shadow sort of just blends into the ground. We're probably going to want something sharper. And the shade of our chair is pretty much the same as the shade of our background. So let's start by fixing that. To do so, I'm going to go over here to my attribute editor on the far right of my window, and I'm going to select the backdrop. Now we're not going to worry about any of this yet. Instead, I'm going to hold right click in the middle of my viewport, and I'm going to come down all the way to the bottom to the Assign New Material section. Let go over that, and we'll get this little pop-up window. These are different kinds of materials we can assign to our objects. For our purposes, I'm just going to choose Lambert. Now my backdrop has turned white, and we have stuff we can change about our textures over here on the right. Let's hit play again. And the backdrop hasn't really changed all that much. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit darker so that it contrasts with our chair. And we can see that now our chair stands out a lot more on our backdrop. Let's maybe make it a little lighter so that we can still get some shadows on it. Alright, now we've got our sky dome and our basic lighting setup. I'm going to go ahead and Control-Alt-S again. And now we're going to add in a couple more lights to make this more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and start with a couple of front lights, and I'm also going to add a rim light in the back so that I get some nice contrast. So I'm going to go up to my Arnold menu one more time, and this time I'm going to go to area light as opposed to sky dome light. And what the area light is if I make it nice and big, is it's sort of like a spotlight, where I have this arrow that points and tells me which way my light is facing. So I'm going to go ahead and add some area lights and have them all point at my chair. Let's go ahead and have this one right here. Control-D, rotate it around, move it to the other side, angle it down a bit, make sure that it's pointing at my chair. Good. Control-D one more time, pull this one to the back, rotate it around, and we'll put this one behind my chair as our rim light. There we go. And I'm also going to make my rim light a little smaller. And this one I'm going to have pointing up towards my chair. Alright. Now I have a rim light and two front lights. Let's go ahead and rename them, make sure that I don't forget which is which. We have rim, we have front, and we have side light. Now let's go ahead and pop open our Arnold render view, see what those have changed, and the answer is not much. And the reason is because the intensity is way too low, and we also don't have exposure. So let's go ahead and start experimenting. I'm going to make the front light green so that it pops out a bit more. Click this color thing, change it to green, and now as I increase my intensity, let's go ahead and type in some numbers. We're going to slowly start seeing that green pop up. So 100 didn't quite do it. Let's change my intensity up to 500. And now that I've got that nice and high, the exposure sort of functions like a multiplier. So I'm going to go ahead and go to 5, and now we get that sharp green on it. Same thing with our side view. I'm going to go ahead and pump up my intensity. Not a whole lot's going to change. Let's increase our exposure. And now I've got this white light over here. Let's go ahead and change that to blue so we can see what that's doing. And our rim light will make red so that we have the whole RGB collection. Change our intensity again. And bump up our exposure a little. Not as high because we want our rim light to be less visible. Let's rotate our rim light so that it's not hitting the ground as much. Rotate it a little higher. There we go. Maybe move it a little closer to our chair. And there we go. So, now that we've gone ahead and set up some basic lights, let's adjust them a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and click my front light. And I'm not a huge fan of having my intensity up that high. I'm going to go ahead and half my intensity and double my exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and go to exposure around 10. And now we're really green. But then I'm going to lower my intensity to half. So let's start with 250. And we're still going to be very, very green. So instead I'm actually going to lower my intensity all the way down to about 20. And now we're still getting that green light, but we can put our light farther away and still keep most of the intensity on the chair. Let's see how that's looking. I like that a lot better. Let's change our color back down to white. And and we can see that we're starting to get those sharp shadows in. Let's do the same thing for our other front light. Crank up our exposure and decrease our intensity. And we're also going to pull this back a bit and rotate it so that the shadows get cast a little further. Good. Maybe our intensity is a bit too high. Let's change those back down to 8. See how that looks. Maybe we can get some better shadows. Yeah, I like that a lot better. And let's lastly change our rim light. If we try to do the same trick and crank up our exposure, we're going to get this really harsh light, so I don't want to change my exposure on my rim light. I'm going to leave my rim light's exposure down to 2 or 3, and I'm going to keep my intensity nice and high so that I can still see the effects on it, on the edges. And we're just going to go ahead and change this to white. Actually, let's see if we can crank our intensity a bit higher. Yeah, just so that it still affects our model, and then we're going to go ahead and swap this to white. Good. So now here is my model and my basic lighting setup. Let's go ahead and Control-Alt-S one more time. And now let's talk about cameras. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and stop our renders, go ahead and minimize that window, and let's position our camera. Let's go ahead and get a good 3/4 view on this, and we generally want a good 3 or 4 different angles, generally a 3/4 view, a side view, and maybe a different 3/4 view or a back view. Once I have my camera in position, I'm going to select my perspective camera in my outliner, and I'm going to hit Control-D to duplicate it. Now that I've got a copy, I'm going to go ahead and rename this Render 1. And in the top left corner of my viewport, I have a bunch of little camera buttons. I'm going to start by right-clicking the first camera, and that'll let me change my camera to a different view. I'm going to go to my Render 1 cam, and you'll notice that at the bottom of my viewport, I now have Render 1. Then I'm going to go ahead and go back to the top left corner of my viewport, and I'm going to click my Lock Camera button, which is the camera with the little lock symbol. And now I can't move this camera at all. This camera is now in position, so let's go ahead and make another one. Go ahead and go back to your regular perspective view. Note that it now says perspective. You can also switch cameras by right-clicking the Select Camera button again and picking your perspective view. Either one works. And now let's pick a different camera perspective. This time I want a side view, so let's go ahead and go to my right view with my view cube. Let's zoom in. Let's make it a little bit more dynamic. Let's call that a good side view. We're going to go ahead and one more time select our perspective camera, duplicate it, Control-D. This one's going to be render_side. Switch my camera to render side with the buttons on the top left of my perspective. Lock that camera, and let's get one more. Swap back to perspective view. This time let's go around the back. Let's get a back 3/4 view. That seems perfectly fine. Select your perspective camera again. And actually, before we duplicate it, let's talk about what happens if you want to adjust your camera. If you accidentally move your camera somewhere weird, and you want to undo your camera motion, you can use the open and close bracket keys next to the enter button on your keyboard to undo and redo camera motion. Alright, let's go ahead and select our perspective camera again, Control-D, and make this the back render. Go ahead and swap over to it and lock it in place. Alright, now we have our 3 render cameras. Let's go ahead and swap one more time to our perspective camera. Now we finally finished setting up our rig. One final thing to do is to select all of your lights and your backdrop and group them together with Ctrl G. And this is going to be our lighting rig. And the reason for that is so that when I move to my back view, I can rotate my rig around and get the same lighting for all of my renders. Now that that's done, let's start our actual rendering. So, first off, our shaded views. Let's pull back our Arnold render. Let's go ahead and hit the stop and hit play again. Now currently, it's rendering out the perspective camera. We can go ahead and click this perspective shape and swap it to either of our render cameras, and it'll swap to that perspective. So currently we've rotated our setup around, so let's go to our back shape, and here is our render. Nearly done. Let's go ahead and adjust our render settings. If we go to the top left, we have this modeling menu. We can go ahead and click this drop down and look for rendering. And what that'll do is it'll change the menus up top to the rendering set. In here we can go to our render tab and we can go to our render settings. By default we are using the Arnold render and our image format is EXRs, which are okay, but you can also change them to PNGs and JPEG, which are better for D2L. Then if we scroll down, we can see all of our cameras which we made. They are set up to render, and if we scroll down a bit more, we can see the default resolution. I'm going to go ahead and change this to 1920 by 1080 because that is a good standard for our images. Now if I go ahead and go to Arnold render, we got it full screen this time. We've got a much larger image, and we can see that progress bar slowly tick up. And as it does, it'll render away some of those samples. But if we zoom in real close to our chair, we can see that our image is still kind of grainy, even as it's closing up rendering. If you want to make your image less grainy, we can go back to our render settings and go to the Arnold render tab. And in here is our sampling settings, and the important one to change is our diffuse up to about 5. 5 is fairly alright, but note that if you change those settings, when you start rendering, it'll take quite a bit longer, and the higher you set it, the finer detail your image will be. So we can see that as it's rendering out, our image is a lot less grainy, but it's taking a lot more time. So again, one more time while that renders out, our render settings should be PNGs or JPEGs, 1920 by 1080. Your resolution can be 72 or 300, either of which is standard, and depending on how much time you want to spend rendering, a diffuse between 2 and 5. Alright, that image is still rendering, so for presentation purposes, I'm going to go ahead and crank my diffuse back down to 2. Let's go ahead and get another quick render out. Pop open my render view one last time. There it is. Let's go ahead and shrink this window down. Whoop. Thank you very much. Render this one out real quick. Now once it's done rendering, what you're going to want to do is go to File and Save Image. So let's go ahead and let this finish up real quick. Once it's done, we're going to go to File and Save Image in our render view, and it's going to, by default, put it in our Projects Images folder. So let's go ahead and name this back_shaded, and you would do that for all 3 of your cameras. Now once you have all of your shaded renders saved, there's still one last step, which is to render out our wireframes. In order to do that, there are a couple of ways. The first is with the aiWireframe, so we're going to select our chair, hold right click, and go down to Assign New Material, and we're going to type in wireframe in the search bar and click aiWireframe. And if we go to our attribute editor, we can go look at that. Here's our new texture. Let's pull up our Arnold render so we can see what we're dealing with. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little smaller and hit play. And we can see our wireframe on our model. Now it's quite a bit different from our actual wireframe, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, our edge type in our material is set to triangles. We're going to go ahead and change that to polygons, and that'll clear some of it up. And the other issue is that our model is currently in smooth preview. If we hit the 1 key, then our wireframe will go back to normal. We also might want to increase our line width because it's there not clearly visible. So let's go ahead and increase that slowly until they're nice and visible. There we go, let that render out. And then once this is done rendering, you'll go ahead and click File and Save again. One more time, if your model is in smooth preview with an aiWireframe texture, it will break your wireframe by showing off a lot more faces than are actually there. So if you're using an aiWireframe to render, do not have your model in smooth preview. That's one way of rendering our wireframes. Let's go ahead and right click and change our texture back to the default standard surface. And let's show the other way of rendering our wireframe. If you go back up to the render settings, you can pop those open and swap your render to Maya Hardware 2.0. We're going to keep the same PNG settings in common, and we're going to keep the same image resolution. But down here in the bottom, in the Maya Hardware 2.0 menu, we're going to change our render mode from shaded or shaded and textured to wire unshaded or wire unshaded and textured. Either of the wire unshaded will work, and what that'll do is instead of using the Arnold render, you're going to go to Render and Render Current Frame, and you'll get a different render window. So in this one we can have our model and our backdrop shown in wireframe, and we can go ahead and put our model in 3 view, re-render the previous frame, and we'll have it show up smooth. Notice that if you have your model selected, your model will show up green, and if you have it deselected, your model will show up in the deselected color. We don't want to show off our backdrop in our wire rendered, so we're also going to go to our channel box, and we're going to create a new layer from our background, create layer from selected, and we're going to hide that layer, re-render, and now we have our isolated chair. So again, if you're using smooth view, you want to use the Maya Hardware 2.0 method instead of an aiWireframe. Once you have all of your wireframes for each of your cameras and all of your shaded renders for each of your cameras, you are going to upload them all to D2L. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next week.